They came onto my land dressed like cops, armed with clipboards and cheap badges, convinced they could tear down everything I built. But here's the truth. They didn't know this ranch isn't just dirt and fences. It's guarded by a man who spent years in the shadows, trained to survive where others break. They thought I'd roll over for their fake laws. Instead, they walked straight into a battlefield I designed. When I first laid eyes on the land, I thought I'd found the quiet ending to a life written in chaos. 150 acres of rolling pasture, pine windbreaks whispering in the evening breeze, a creek that cut through the middle like a silver vein. It was all mine. I had fought hard to get here, scraping through years of contracts overseas, work that left scars on the body and deeper ones in the mind. People like me don't usually get happy endings, but when I signed the deed and set foot on this soil, I swore to myself that this place would be different. It was supposed to be peace. It was supposed to be home. My days settled into a rhythm that felt almost alien at first. I'd wake before dawn, not because I had to, but because years of discipline don't just fade with a signature on retirement papers. The dogs would bark for breakfast, the goats bleated for their hay, and the old John Deere tractor coughed to life like a grumpy uncle every morning. There was comfort in that rhythm, in mending fences, instead of breaking people and coaxing tomatoes out of stubborn clay soil, instead of planning logistics for raids. Silence out here wasn't empty. It was full of the wind through the grass, the rustle of the barn roof, the contented snorts of livestock bedding down at night. I remember sitting on the porch one morning, coffee steaming in an old enamel mug, when it hit me for the first time in decades. I didn't owe anyone anything. No chain of command, no hidden agenda, no missions whispered under cover of night. Just me, my land, and the freedom I had earned. For a man who had lived too long under orders, freedom can feel suspicious, even dangerous. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. And sure enough it did, but not in a way I could have predicted. It started with a sign, a flimsy white sheet of plastic zip-tied to my front fence like an uninvited guest. The words stenciled across it made me laugh at first. Notice property under review. Harmony Creek, HOA compliance required. HOA. Out here, I lived 20 minutes from the nearest paved road, half an hour from town, and even the post office had trouble finding my mailbox. There were no subdivisions, no cul-de-sacs, no rows of cookie-cutter houses with perfect lawns, just ranches, farmland, and a scattering of stubborn old-timers who'd rather patch their own roofs than call for help. And yet here it was, an HOA notice nailed like gospel to my fence. I tore it down without a second thought and tossed it into the burn barrel by the barn. Probably a prank, I figured. Some teenagers with too much time, or maybe a neighbor who thought himself clever. I went about my chores, fixing a loose gate, cutting firewood, pretending it meant nothing. But something gnawed at me even as the sign curled and blackened in the flames. Because I've seen how power works. It never shows up all at once. It arrives like a trickle disguised as harmless until it builds into a flood. The second sign came 2 days later. Bigger this time. Laminated. Zip-tied higher on the fence so I'd have to grab a ladder to tear it down. Same words, same fake seal stamped at the bottom. And that's when the suspicion crept in. This wasn't a prank. Someone out there believed they had authority here. Authority over me. Old instincts stirred awake. You don't spend years in places where a wrong turn can cost lives without learning to recognize the scent of an operation. Whoever was behind this wasn't just bored. They had intent, maybe even backing. I stood at the fence line staring at that second sign and felt a pulse of something I hadn't in years, anger sharpened by focus. This was my land, legally purchased, taxes, paid deed, recorded at the county courthouse. No committee of strangers had any claim here. But the problem with people like that, people who get drunk on the smell of control, is that they don't need a claim. They just need a clipboard and a little fear to spread like wildfire. That night I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything I'd seen, the wording of the sign, the fake HOA name, the time I found it. Old habits die hard, and I kept logs the way I used to write field reports. If there was a fight coming, I wanted a record. By the third day, the silence of the ranch felt heavier. My dogs barked more often at shadows near the fence line. I thought I caught movement once, figures at the edge of the woods watching retreating when I turned on the floodlights. Neighbors who once waved from their trucks as they passed on the gravel road drove by, faster eyes fixed forward, not meeting mine. Something was shifting. That's when I understood the HOA signs weren't just meant for me. They were meant for everyone else. A warning, a message, painting me as the outlier, the non-compliant. They wanted me isolated. That's how control starts. Convince the group one man is the problem, then break him down piece by piece. I went to bed late that night, rifle propped against the wall, coffee thermos still warm on the nightstand. I told myself it was just paranoia, just old training, flaring up in peacetime. But in my gut, I knew the truth. Peace had never been the whole story. Not for me. And certainly not for Karen, though I didn't know her name yet. Because in less than 24 hours, she would drive up my gravel road in her spotless SUV, pastel blouse-mirrored sunglasses reflecting the land she thought she owned. And she would introduce herself not just as a neighbor, but as the president. The president of an HOA that didn't exist until she decided it did. And that was the day my quiet ranch life turned into a war zone. The morning she arrived, I was knee-deep in mud fixing a busted water pipe that had frozen overnight. My hands were raw, cold, and slick with rust and grit when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. At first, I thought it was a delivery truck. Nobody else ever bothered to drive this far down the road. But the sound was too deliberate, slow, purposeful, like a patrol car pulling someone over. I straightened, wiping my hands on a rag, and that's when I saw it. A silver SUV, spotless, as if it had just rolled off the showroom floor, crept up the driveway, and stopped halfway across the gravel, angled like it was blocking a road. The door opened and out stepped a woman who didn't belong out here. Not by a long shot. She wore a pastel pink blouse tucked into pressed khaki shoes so white they practically glowed against the mud. Mirrored sunglasses hid her eyes, but the tilt of her chin told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a social call. She carried herself like she owned the ground beneath her feet, clipboard tucked under her arm like a sidearm, as if authority itself had dressed her that morning. I leaned against the fence post waiting. "Help you?" I asked, voice flat. She smiled like she was hosting a bake sale. "Good morning, I'm Karen Whitfield, president of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association." The words hit me like a bad punchline. I actually laughed. "This is farmland, lady. There's no HOA out here." Her smile didn't falter. "Oh, but there is. Harmony Creek HOA is a chartered community coalition dedicated to maintaining environmental and visual standards for the benefit of all residents. And you, Mr. She glanced down at her clipboard as if checking my file. "You're currently in review." In review, I repeated like she'd just informed me my goats had a driver's license renewal due. "Yes. We've noted several infractions. Fence height discrepancies, unauthorized livestock structures, satellite dish visibility from the southern corridor. We're currently in an awareness phase, but citations will begin at the end of the month." I stared at her mud still dripping from my boots. "You can't cite a goat." She tilted her head, sweet as sugar. "We don't cite the goats. We cite their owners." For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the pasture. I could feel my pulse slowing into something dangerous the way it used to when I knew trouble was sizing me up. She handed me a manila envelope heavy labeled "Action Required." I didn't open it. I tossed it into the bed of my truck. "You're trespassing," I said. Karen ignored me, pivoting on her heel like she had just delivered a jury summons. She walked back to her SUV with calm, measured steps, climbed in, and drove away, gravel spitting under her tires. I climbed into the truck and opened the envelope. Inside, page after page of regulations, complete with diagrams of my barn, red-circled photos of my fencing from angles I didn't even know existed. Someone had been watching my land. Watching me. My blood went cold. I fed the entire packet to the burn barrel that evening, watched the flames lick at the papers, turning her regulations into ash. But I knew enough about people like her to understand this wouldn't be the end. This was just the opening salvo. The next day proved me right. I woke to find new signs plastered across my property. Not just the fence this time, but nailed to the barn door, zip-tied to the gate, even one laminated and stapled high into the post by the driveway. They were bigger, bolder, stamped with fake seals, all shouting the same message. "Under enforcement review, violations pending." I tore them down one by one, fury heating my blood. When I ripped the last sign off the barn, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the mud. Not mine, not the dog's. Too large to belong to anyone but outsiders. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the tree line, I spotted them. 2 men walking my fence line like soldiers on patrol. They wore khakis and cheap tactical vests, iron-on patches stitched crooked across their chests that read HOA Patrol. One carried a walkie-talkie, the other scribbled into a notebook. I stepped off the porch. "Something I can help you with, boys." They froze, caught like deer in headlights. One of them stammered, "We're conducting a compliance sweep under HOA protocol." "Got a badge?" I asked. "We operate under the Harmony Creek Charter," the other answered, trying to sound official. "Great," I said. "Then you're trespassing under the Whitaker Ranch Charter. Now leave." They shuffled, exchanged looks, then retreated to their SUV. As they drove off, a clipboard slipped from one man's grip and landed in the dirt. I picked it up. Inside, I found patrol maps. routes sketched across multiple properties, each one marked with red X's. My land was labeled Alpha, high resistance. That night, I called an old friend in town, a sheriff's deputy named Grant. When I explained what I'd seen, he whistled. Karen Whitfield, he said. She's been trying this crap for a while. Filed complaints about the feed store called Livestock Noise a disturbance. Always brushed off because no one took her seriously. But sounds like she's escalating. Escalating. That word sat heavy in my gut, because escalation doesn't end at signs and fake clipboards. Escalation means intent, means backup, means preparation for the next move. I checked my security cameras, replaced the batteries and the motion sensors, wired up the floodlights I hadn't needed in years. Nothing lethal, just enough to remind anyone foolish enough to cross my line that this land bites back. That night, as I locked the barn, I looked out at the horizon and saw headlights lingering far longer than they should have on the dirt road. Whoever they weren't lost. They were watching. Karen had made her move, and I knew in my bones the next one wouldn't be as polite. The days that followed were like watching a storm gather on the horizon. It didn't hit all at once, but piece by piece, little shifts made it clear that peace on the ranch was slipping away. At first, it was the signs bigger, heavier, more permanent. One morning, I found a sheet of plywood nailed right to the gate, spray-painted with bold letters, violations pending. Property under enforcement. Not laminated this time. Not something a gust of wind could carry away. This was built to last. But the real escalation wasn't the signs. It was the people. I started spotting them more often, men in their 30s or 40s moving in pairs along the fence line like they were conducting military patrols. They weren't neighbors. I knew every farmer within 10 miles, and these weren't any of them. They wore khakis boots and those same ridiculous tactical vests with iron-on patches stitched across the front HOA patrol. It would have been laughable if not for the way they moved, organized, deliberate, scanning the property like they'd been given orders. One afternoon, I caught them pointing at my tractor. One muttered into his radio. Another scribbled something onto a clipboard. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were cataloging. I stepped off the porch, wiping grease from my hands. You boys lost. They froze their eyes, flicking to one another. Finally, the one with the clipboard stammered, "We're conducting a compliance sweep under Harmony Creek HOA regulations." I walked closer, closing the space between us. "You got a badge. We operate under the community charter," the second one said, his voice rehearsed like he'd been fed the line. "Then you're trespassing under the Whitaker Ranch charter," I said flatly. "Leave." They backed off, shuffled toward their SUV, and climbed in. But as the vehicle pulled away, something slipped from the clipboard guy's grip and fluttered into the dirt. A map. I bent down and picked it up. My stomach turned cold. The paper was filled with patrol routes, hand-drawn grids of properties in the valley, marked with red X's. Some were circled, others labeled. Mine was scrawled with a single word in thick black marker, Alpha, high resistance. I stood there, staring at it, heart thudding in my chest. Alpha, high resistance. They weren't just monitoring me, they were targeting me. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo. Then I called Deputy Grant. He answered on the second ring. "Talk to me." I explained what I'd found, my voice tight with anger. When I mentioned the map, he went quiet for a beat. "Karen Whitfield," he muttered. "She's been building this thing for months. Filed complaints against the feed store called Livestock. A public disturbance, tried to fine an old rancher for hanging a flag. Everyone laughed her off. But you've got land. Real land. She sees that as leverage. Leverage for what I asked. Power," he said simply. "The kind she's been craving for years." That night I walked the perimeter of my ranch with a flashlight, the dogs trailing close at my side. Every crunch of gravel, every rustle of wind through the pines had me on edge. I'd lived through ambushes in deserts halfway across the world, but this was different. This was home. And now it was under siege by people who thought clipboards and fake bylaws gave them dominion over me. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I dug out the gear I hadn't touched in years. Old motion sensors, trail cams, solar-powered floodlights. I strung them along the fence line, rigged alarms on the barn doors, even set up a few improvised deterrents, nothing lethal, just loud, bright, disorienting. Enough to remind anyone crossing into my land that I wasn't some pushover waiting to be bullied into submission. And I was right to prepare because the signs of escalation kept coming. 2 days later, I woke to find not one but 5 new notices nailed to different spots around the property. They weren't flimsy printouts anymore. These were laminated sheets mounted on stakes, hammered deep into the soil. Each bore the fake HOA seal and bold red text declaring under enforcement review, non-compliant. It wasn't just about me seeing them. It was about anyone passing by. Neighbors driving down the dirt road couldn't miss them. That was the strategy: isolate me, brand me as the outsider, make everyone else think I was the problem. And it was working. The old man who sold me feed at the co-op barely made eye contact when I came in. A family that used to wave as they drove by now sped past windows rolled up. Even the post office clerk seemed jumpier than usual, muttering something about keeping order in the valley. Karen's propaganda machine was working faster than I'd expected. The worst was when I caught one of my neighbors, Jerry, a man who'd shared a beer with me at last year's 4th of July cookout, walking the fence line with one of those HOA patrol types. He avoided my gaze, kept his eyes on the ground, while the clipboard guy pointed at my barn and jotted notes. I didn't shout, I didn't raise hell, but inside, something broke. Karen had followers now. That night, as I sat on the porch with my coffee cooling in my hands, I heard the crunch of gravel again. Not one vehicle this time. 2. Headlights killed before they reached the driveway. My dogs growled low in their throats. I slipped inside, killed the interior lights, and watched from the side window. 5 shadows moved in the moonlight, slow, deliberate, skirting the edge of the barn. Flashlights off, but earpieces in. Vests, khakis, clipboards. Clipboard guy raised his hand. A whisper crackled through the radio. Team Alpha in position. Begin sweep. Target presumed armed but compliant under Phase 1. I almost laughed. Almost. Because right then I knew 2 things. 1, they weren't going to stop. And 2, they had no idea what kind of battlefield they'd just stepped onto. I leaned back from the window, heart steady, breath even. The hum inside me, the one I hadn't felt since Kandahar was awake again. The game had changed. They thought they were the hunters. But come dawn, they'd learn this land belonged to me. And out here, I wrote the rules. The night it truly began, the air was too still. I've lived through enough firefights to know when quiet is natural and when it's forced. And that night, every instinct in my bones screamed unnatural. Even the chickens, usually noisy before dawn, kept silent in their coop. The dogs shifted uneasily at the foot of the porch, ears pricked toward the tree line. It was 3 in the morning when I heard the crunch. Not a truck, not deer, too coordinated. Crunch, pause, crunch, crunch. A rhythm, human. I slid on my boots mug of yesterday's reheated coffee, still warm in my hand. I didn't panic. Panic is what gets men killed. Instead, I did what years of training had burned into me, moved quiet, measured, and deliberate. From the mudroom, I killed the interior lights and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The moon was high, painting the pasture silver. Out near the barn, shadows moved. 5, maybe 6. They were dressed the same as before, khakis vests, cheap iron-on patches reading HOA patrol. But this time they carried more. Headlamps strapped to their foreheads like coal miners, radios with earpieces, and clipboards as if paperwork gave them power. One whispered into his mic, Team Alpha in position. Begin, sweep. Target presumed armed but compliant under Phase 1. I almost laughed out loud. Armed but compliant. That was the kind of phrase written by someone who's never stared down a real barrel. I crouched, low eyes, scanning the field. 3 of them veered toward the east fence, where Linda the goat slept like a queen in her pen. 2 more lingered near the front gate, glancing nervously toward the house. Clipboard guy stood dead center eyes, sweeping pen tapping against the board like a drumbeat. They thought they were in control. They didn't know they'd walk straight into my web. Weeks earlier, I had prepared not for war, but for nonsense. Motion sensors strung along the perimeter, floodlights wired to tripwires, sirens hidden in the trees, old tricks I learned overseas adapted for a ranch. Nothing lethal, just enough to disorient, to remind intruders that the ground beneath their boots belonged to me. The first one tripped the wire, a sharp click, then boom. Not an explosion, but light. High-beam floodlights roared to life, illuminating the barnyard like Times Square. Sirens screamed from hidden speakers, piercing and chaotic. 2 men dropped, flat, blinded ears ringing. Another dove for cover behind the water trough, fumbling with his radio. Linda the goat, startled from her pen, lowered her head and rammed the nearest intruder square in the thigh. The man flipped over, crashing into the dirt, his clipboard flying into the air. Linda stood over him, glaring like a sentry, demanding his papers. I stepped onto the porch, slow, deliberate, coffee mug still in hand. The dogs bristled at my feet, but didn't advance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Good morning, gentlemen, I said evenly. Y'all planning to announce yourselves, or were you hoping for the element of surprise? Clipboard guy staggered upright, shielding his eyes against the floodlights. His voice cracked, but he tried to sound official. We are acting under HOA emergency code 7 ampere to seize non-compliant property. I raised an eyebrow. Did y'all make that one up in a coloring book? Another shaking raised something from his belt. A taser, cheap and clunky. His hands trembled. This is a citizens enforcement zone. We are within operational bounds. I took one step down from the porch, never breaking eye contact. You're in my yard. Armed. Threatening seizure of property under laws printed off at a library computer. That's not enforcement. That's trespassing. Clipboard guy reached into his folder and pulled out papers. This document authorizes us. I snatched it before he could finish. Half the pages were marked. Draft 1 had a coffee stain. Another, a slice of melted cheese fused to the corner. I held it up, shaking my head. This looks like it was written by a sleep-deprived 10th grader with control issues. Before he could respond, a new sound cut through the chaos. Tires crunching gravel. Not theirs. This time, real. Red and blue lights stuttered down the driveway like divine judgment. A sheriff's cruiser rolled in, slow and deliberate. The fake enforcers froze. Clipboard guy muttered into his mic, "Abort. Abort." But it was too late. Deputy Grant Sheriff Langston Tomo stepped out of the cruiser. Square jaw, eyes narrowed, hand resting on his holster. He scanned the scene, my floodlights glaring, intruders scattered across the yard, Linda glaring at a man who dared to step near her pen. "Whitaker," he said, voice flat. "What the hell is this?" I sipped my coffee. "Pre-dawn theater," I answered. "Opening act, HOA SWAT team." Langston turned to the group. "Hands where I can see them. Drop the clipboards." One man stammered, "We're acting under civilian compliance jurisdiction." Langston walked up, grabbed the badge off the nearest vest, and ripped it clean away. He held it up, reading. "Compliance Officer, Tier 2. Buddy, you're lucky this doesn't say mall cop." He pulled a leather-bound binder from one of their packs. On the cover, Harmony Creek Compliance Authority, Internal Codex. He flipped it open, shaking his head at color-coded charts, laminated bylaws, violation classes ranging from fence misalignment to hostile rooster activity. "I've seen cults with fewer rules," he muttered. I caught his eye. "Karen," he nodded. "Yeah, this has her fingerprints all over it." By the time the cuffs clicked onto their wrists, my yard looked like a stage. After the curtain fell, papers, scattered radios, abandoned clipboards broken in the dirt. But my gut told me this wasn't the finale. Karen wouldn't back down. Not after tonight. And I was right. Because later that very night, while the sheriff was still filing reports, I found a new envelope in my mailbox, stamped certified. Inside was a lawsuit Karen suing me for hostile disruption of sanctioned community action. And tucked behind the legal jargon was a list of names, not just mine, neighbors, people I'd shared meals with, and next to one name in sharp black ink a single word, informant. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a feud. This wasn't petty power. This was war. Sheriff Langston didn't waste time after that night. He stayed long enough to slap cuffs on the so-called HOA patrol, read them their rights, and haul them into the back of his cruiser. But I knew the paperwork alone wouldn't scratch the surface of what was really going on. Karen wasn't just improvising with clipboards and laminated signs. She had a system, rules, ranks, patrols, even a script. And systems don't grow this fast without money planning and a leader pulling strings behind the curtain. The following morning, Langston called me into town. The sheriff's office was a squat brick building with more dust than staff, but it smelled like law and order all the same. When I walked into his office, he had the binder open on his desk. Pages spread everywhere, laminated charts, lists of violations, detailed patrol routes. One page in particular was highlighted in neon yellow. It had my name scrawled across the top, underlined twice, with the classification high resistance, target alpha. Langston rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I've seen a lot in this county. Bootleggers, cattle thieves, meth labs out in the sticks. But this," he tapped the binder, "this is organized harassment. Someone's building an army with office supplies." I leaned on the desk. "This isn't just about harassment. Look at the structure. They've got classes of violations, patrol sectors, enforcement tiers. This is training material. A damn manual." He nodded grimly. "We're treating it as fraud and impersonation for now. But I've got a bad feeling this goes deeper." As if to prove his point, he slid a folded sheet across the desk. "We pulled this off one of the men we arrested last night. It was a spreadsheet, names, addresses, and notes scribbled in shorthand. Beside my property, written in all caps, obstructionist, escalate pressure. Several other names were crossed out, marked with words like compliant or exit achieved. These people sold their land," Langston explained, voice low, cheap, quick. Didn't make sense at the time, but now I'm starting to think they were forced out. I clenched my fists. My ranch wasn't just land, it was my last shot at peace. And now Karen was turning it into a battlefield. That night the valley felt colder. Neighbors who once waved now turned their heads away. Jerry, the same man who once helped me raise a barn beam, avoided eye contact when I passed him on the road. Even the feed store clerk shifted uncomfortably, raising his prices a few cents each time I came in. Karen's poison was spreading, and it was working. 2 days later, I found flyers staked into the ground at the road entrance. Grainy aerial photos of my ranch, probably from a drone printed in black and white. Bold letters underneath read Zone B non-compliant, high risk. Bullet points listed my so-called violations: unauthorized livestock, hostile behavior, illegal fencing. At the bottom, residents are advised to avoid contact. It hit me harder than I expected. Isolation is a weapon, and she was wielding it masterfully. Langston showed up that evening holding another stack of flyers he'd confiscated from a nearby mailbox cluster. She's not backing down. She's doubling down. And I've got word she's holding a community meeting tomorrow. No permit, just her driveway, a folding table, and a microphone. I stood on the porch, coffee steaming in my hands, and nodded. Then it's time I saw what she's building. The next evening, I parked across from Karen's sprawling suburban-style house. The driveway had been transformed into a rally stage. A fold-out table sat at the front, stacked with clipboards and laminated sheets. Behind it, a cheap microphone crackled on a stand. A hand-painted sign read Emergency Compliance Briefing, Tier 3 Response. At least 15 people stood in the crowd. Some looked confused, others looked eager. A few wore reflective safety vests, stenciled with the fake HOA logo. Karen tapped the mic, her voice cutting through the dusk. "We are under siege," she announced. "Not from outsiders, but from within. One resident has refused compliance for 3 consecutive review cycles. He has verbally threatened officers. He has rejected dialogue." She held up one of the drone photos of my barn. "He thinks he's untouchable, but no one is above the rules." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few nodded, clapping faintly. Karen passed out flyers like communion wafers, her tone rising with righteous fervor. "He calls it freedom. We call it negligence, disorder, a threat to our community." I stood on the shoulder of the road, arms crossed, making no attempt to hide. When she pointed directly at me, I didn't flinch. Effective immediately, she declared the HOA is initiating community isolation protocol. No favors, no support, no engagement. The crowd clapped harder. My stomach sank. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was indoctrination. She was building a regime, one clipboard at a time. Later that night, I found another laminated notice stuffed in my mailbox. This one was personal. Resident classification Tier 3, critical non-compliant. Below it, a list of demands: remove livestock, repaint barn, neutral gray, attend re-education seminar, and submit an apology statement to the board. The kicker, the seminar, was scheduled to take place in Karen's garage. One of the sessions was titled, "Silent Fences, How Your Property Speaks for You." I nearly choked laughing until I realized how dangerous it was, because people were actually buying it. Langston came by the next morning, his cruiser idling at the end of the driveway. "She's escalating again. You think she'll stop?" I shook my head, staring at the laminated notice still clutched in my hand. Number Karen doesn't stop. She doubles down. And the scary part, she's got people following her now. The sheriff exhaled, eyes grim. "Then we'd better get ready, because this isn't just about you anymore. She's aiming bigger. And I've got a bad feeling she's not working alone." That night, as I stood on the porch, listening to the hum of insects in the dark, I realized he was right. The signs, the patrols, the flyers, the rallies, it was all too organized, too coordinated. Karen wasn't improvising. She was executing a plan. And the worst part, she was just getting started. When Karen shifted from harassment to psychological warfare, I knew the game had entered a new stage. It wasn't just clipboards and fake bylaws anymore. It was propaganda control and the slow poisoning of an entire community's perception of me. The flyers multiplied overnight. Where there had once been a handful stapled to fence posts, now there were dozens staked into every patch of grass, from the feed store to the church parking lot. Each one carried the same aerial shot of my ranch with the words "non-compliant, high risk." Beneath that, the bullet points listed infractions as if they were criminal charges: unauthorized livestock, illegal fencing, hostile behavior toward officers. And the final line in bold red: residents are advised to avoid unsanctioned contact. It worked. The isolation became palpable. Neighbors who once lingered at my gate to swap stories now drove past without slowing. The cashier at the gas station who used to slip me an extra cup of coffee for free suddenly charged full price with a stiff smile. Even the pastor at the small country church stopped sending invitations to the monthly potluck. The valley was turning against me, not because of what I'd done, but because Karen had made me a symbol of defiance, an enemy to community order. That kind of power doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from fear. And Karen knew how to stoke it. Her rally in the driveway proved it. I went again not to confront her, but to watch, to see what kind of following she had built. This time, there were nearly 30 people gathered, some of them in those ridiculous reflective vests stamped with HOA enforcement. Others clutched clipboards like they were shields. Karen stood at the front, microphone in hand, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. "We are not tyrants," she said, every word measured. "We are protectors. And when one person refuses to comply, it endangers the order we've built together." She held up a flyer with my face printed in grainy black and white. "This resident has chosen hostility over harmony, and we will not allow it." The crowd clapped. Some shouted, "Hear, hear," like they were at a town hall meeting. I stood across the street, arms folded, letting her see me. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pointed. "There he is, the problem. He mocks our rules, ignores our warnings, and insults our officers. He believes his land makes him untouchable. But we are stronger than any one man." For the first time, I saw not just her ambition, but her charisma. She had tapped into the loneliness and frustration of ordinary people and twisted it into loyalty. It didn't matter that her rules were fake. To them, it felt real, and that made it dangerous. When I shouted back, "You call a goat screaming at 6 a.m. a security threat," the crowd laughed nervously, but Karen didn't miss a beat. "We call it disorder," she said firmly, "and disorder spreads like disease." That night, I found another laminated notice in my mailbox. It wasn't addressed through the postal service. It had been hand-delivered. Resident Classification Tier 3, Critical Non-Compliant. Below it, instructions were listed like commandments: remove livestock, repaint barn, attend re-education seminar. The kicker, the seminar was scheduled in Karen's garage. I stared at the detail session topics like silent fences, how your property speaks for you, and compliance is community care. It was laughable, but also chilling. Because what terrified me wasn't the absurdity, it was that people would attend. The following days brought darker turns. My trail cameras, which I'd placed along the fence line, began to fail one by one. Not from dead batteries or weather damage, cut wires. Precise, deliberate. Whoever was out there knew exactly where the cameras were and how to disable them. Then came the sedan. White-tinted windows, no plates. It appeared one night parked 2 properties down, idling without moving for hours. I watched through binoculars, flashlight ready in my hand. When I stepped toward it, the engine roared, and the car peeled off, disappearing down the gravel road. I ran the plates when I finally caught a glimpse. They came back registered to something called Community Horizon Outreach. And guess whose name was listed as Director Karen? She wasn't just an HOA president anymore. She had built a shell nonprofit to shield her surveillance operation. It might have been laughable, except it wasn't. Because 2 nights later, I found Max, my 8-year-old border collie, whimpering near the barn. His paw bled from a deep-cut glass shards embedded in the dirt where he'd stepped. I gathered him in my arms, my chest burning as his body trembled against mine. This wasn't an accident, it was a message. Langston came 20 minutes later, flashlight sweeping the barn floor. He crouched, picking up a shard of green-brown glass. "This wasn't random," he said, voice low. "Somebody planted it." I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just stroked Max's fur and whispered, "I've got you, buddy. You're safe." But inside, something shifted. Karen had crossed a line. Signs, flyers, rallies, those were games of intimidation. But hurting my dog, that was war. The next morning, I made a choice. If Karen wanted to play this game in the shadows, I'd drag it into the light. I uploaded everything: videos of the fake raid copies of her flyers, pictures of Max's injury, screenshots of the binder Langston had confiscated. I posted it online with one caption: "When the HOA thinks they're the FBI." It spread like wildfire. By sundown, the video had tens of thousands of views. Comments poured in from other rural homeowners. "We've seen this in our area too. They tried the same playbook on us." Within 24 hours, it had over 300,000 views. Karen's carefully crafted narrative began to crack. Her online defenders vanished. The so-called HOA patrol, half of them quit. But Karen didn't fold, not her. 2 days later, she showed up at my door. No SUV full of patrol goons this time, no clipboard, just a plain manila folder in her hand. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her voice carried a new edge. "You think this is about goats?" she asked. I said nothing. "You think this ends with me?" She stepped forward, pressed the folder against my chest. "You've kicked something you don't understand." And then she walked away, gravel crunching under her spotless shoes. Inside the folder were documents stamped with government seals I recognized, letters, memos, and a title that turned my blood cold. Rural Behavioral Management Phase 2. This wasn't just Karen anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. The moment I opened that folder, my stomach dropped. I had expected more flyers, maybe some trumped-up legal threats written in Karen's flowery handwriting. But this wasn't Karen's doing, not entirely. These pages looked official. They carried seals, letterheads, formatting too clean to be mocked up on a home printer. And worse than that, I recognized some of the acronyms. I'd seen them before, years ago, stamped across documents I thought I'd left behind in a world of shadow operations and classified briefings. The top page read, Rural Behavioral Management, Phase 2. Underneath dense paragraphs, detailed community cohesion tactics, reintegration protocols, and resident classification systems. It wasn't just HOA cosplay anymore. This was doctrine, real doctrine. And it bore a disturbing resemblance to the strategies I had once seen deployed in war zones overseas, except this time it wasn't aimed at insurgents, it was aimed at citizens. I drove into town and met Sheriff Langston at the diner before his shift started. The place was quiet, just the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease hanging in the air. I slid the folder across the table. "She gave me this," I said. Langston flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with each turn. "Where the hell did this come from, Karen?" I said. "She handed it to me on purpose. Said I'd kick something I couldn't stop." Langston exhaled through his nose, a long, low sound that told me he was rattled. "This isn't fake. These seals, these stamps, they're real. If this is legit, it means she's tied into something bigger than this county. Bigger than me." By afternoon, he had called the county attorney, a woman named Caldwell. She drove out with an investigator and a portable scanner. They set up in my kitchen, scanning each page, running the seals through federal databases. By sundown, they had their answer. "It's authentic," Caldwell said grimly. "This program isn't on the books anymore, at least not officially. But parts of it, they were piloted in rural regions about 10 years back." I stiffened. I knew. Because I had been there. I had seen pieces of this exact doctrine drafted in conference rooms overseas. They called them post-conflict engagement zones. The language was different, but the intent was the same: reshape communities by controlling information, enforcing conformity, isolating dissenters. And now it was here, weaponized in the hands of a woman with a clipboard and a craving for power. The next morning, Langston and 2 agents rolled up to Karen's house with a warrant. I came along not as a deputy, not as a participant, but because I needed to see it. Karen answered the door with that same smug smirk she always wore. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked sweetly. Langston held it up. "Yes, ma'am. Signed and sealed." "You're making a mistake," she said, but she stepped aside, letting them in. Her house looked ordinary from the outside: neat garden beds, pastel paint, a wind chime tinkling in the breeze. But inside, it was something else. The living room was staged with framed photos of community events, most of which looked suspiciously like staged compliance seminars. And then, behind a false panel in her study, the agents found a narrow doorway leading into a hidden back office. The air inside was cold, recycled, humming with the faint buzz of electronics. Along the walls were binders, dozens of them, each labeled with chilling precision: resident tier guide compliance scripts, corrective language index, psychological reinforcement tactics asset conversion model. A whiteboard hung at the far end, covered in names and faces, maps of properties, arrows, and codes. My ranch was dead center, circled in red. Notes scrawled in marker red: subject wakes 4:50 a.m. Livestock fed by 6:00, rarely visitors. Defiant, autonomous, vigilant. Langston turned to me, eyes wide. "They were profiling you." I swallowed hard. "Not just me. Look again." He flipped through more binders. 6 other residents. One labeled compliant, another marked exit achieved, another labeled pending disruption. That last one was a woman who had moved out just last month, selling her land cheap. On a map pinned to the back wall, 3 counties were covered in red, blue, and black pins. Each had codes beside them: P1 for probationary, P2 for persuasion, P3 for physical relocation encouraged. Langston stepped back, muttering, "This isn't HOA. This is psychological warfare." They boxed everything up: binders, maps, computers, even the monitors that still showed frozen camera feeds. One of those feeds was of my barn. Another was of Jerry's front porch. another of the feed store parking lot. Back at the sheriff's office, the evidence piled higher. Caldwell shook her head, flipping through the files. She's tied into something bigger. Whoever funded her gave her playbooks, targets, surveillance tools. This isn't grassroots. The charges stacked up quickly: harassment wire, fraud impersonating officials, illegal surveillance, conspiracy to defraud. Karen's lawyer tried to spin it, calling it a community cohesion experiment. But even Langston laughed at that. A cult with laminated rules is still a cult, he said. But the part that kept me awake that night wasn't the charges. It was the hard drives they seized. One folder labeled Phase 3, Strategy Outline. Another marked Phase 4, Contingency. If Phase 2 was about isolation and control, what the hell did Phase 4 mean? I didn't have to wonder long. Because buried in those drives, investigators found files with signatures I recognized. Names from D.C., old intel officers, retired contractors, men I had once seen in briefings about reshaping societies. Karen wasn't the architect. She was the pilot program, a test. And I had been chosen as the primary resistance node. That realization sank like lead in my gut, because if this was a test, it meant there were others. Other valleys, other communities, other farmers, ranchers, small-town families, all about to be targeted, isolated, and broken the same way. And unless I did something, Karen would be replaced by another face, another smiling enforcer with a clipboard and a script. That night, I sat on the porch rifle across my lap, Max asleep at my feet. The stars glittered above silent witnesses to a storm rolling across the land, and I made a decision. I wasn't just going to defend my ranch. I was going to drag this entire operation into the light, because Karen thought she was waging an HOA war. But what she'd really done was wake up the wrong man. The days after the raid on Karen's house felt like the uneasy calm before a storm. On paper, the county had what it needed: binders, charts, surveillance footage, and even her handwritten notes. But my instincts told me the fight wasn't finished. You don't build something as elaborate as rural behavioral management and leave it all in one suburban house. Karen wasn't the top of the food chain. She was just the face, the zealot they chose to front the program. And people like her don't quit, they escalate. I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, I heard it again. That rhythm of boots on gravel, deliberate and measured. But this time it wasn't 5 men with clipboards. It was more. My motion sensors lit up like Christmas, pinging one after the other. The dogs growled, low hackles raised. I stepped to the side window already, knowing what I'd see. 7 figures. Black vests, boots, radios clipped tight. 2 carried rifles, real ones this time, not cheap airsoft toys. Their movements were too clean to be amateurs. They weren't soldiers, not quite, but they'd been drilled. And right in the middle was Clipboard Guy, the one who had led the last raid. His hands gripped a folder like it contained holy scripture. They stopped at the end of the driveway. Clipboard Guy raised his voice loud enough to reach me on the porch. "We're here for seizure protocol," he declared. "You've failed to comply with re-education notices. Your property and vehicle are listed as forfeitable under Emergency Clause B9. I stepped out slowly, rifle slung across my back, coffee mug in hand, like I didn't have a care in the world. "Emergency Clause B9, I said, raising an eyebrow. "Did you pull that out of a cereal box?" One of the riflemen shifted nervously, eyes darting toward the tree line. The other stood calm, too calm, his gaze fixed on the door behind me as if he already had orders to breach. Clipboard Guy straightened his spine, reading from the folder. "You've been designated a primary resistance node. You are outnumbered. Don't make this hard." I took 1 step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel. "Tell me something," I said. He blinked. "What? Who trained you?" He hesitated. That was all I needed to know. These weren't lawmen. They weren't military. They were believers. Volunteers groomed by Karen's gospel, now armed and dangerous. I tapped the silent trigger on my watch. With a hiss of hydraulics, steel barriers rose across the driveway, cutting off their retreat. Floodlights snapped on. Not steady beams this time, but strobe pulses of red and white, designed to confuse and disorient. Sirens wailed from hidden speakers, shrieking at alternating frequencies that scrambled thought and balance. The twitchy rifleman panicked first. He raised his weapon finger, twitching on the trigger. That was his mistake. From the corners of the deck, 2 flashbangs I'd rigged weeks earlier launched and detonated in tandem. The field erupted in white light and concussive sound. Men staggered, dropped to their knees, clawing at their ears. I moved fast, years of training taking over. Rolling from the side stair, I cut right and closed on the twitchy rifleman before he could recover. I wrenched the barrel sideways, slammed his shoulder into the gravel, and pinned him with my knee. He didn't even fight his brain, still scrambled from the flashbang. The calm rifleman bolted toward the woods but froze when headlights swept across the yard. A cruiser pulled in silent, no siren, no drama. Sheriff Langston stepped out, sidearm, drawn, voice steady as iron. "Weapons down," he barked. "Now." Clipboard guy fumbled, reaching into his folder. Langston fired a warning shot into the dirt, a puff of gravel exploding between the man's boots. The sound cut through the chaos, sharper than the sirens. One by one, the intruders dropped their weapons. But then the woods shifted. 4 more figures emerged, hands raised, moving slow. That made 7 in total, 7 armed, drilled, and ready to enforce Karen's protocols. Langston cuffed the first one and glanced at me. His voice was low, urgent. "They said they're part of something bigger." I nodded grimly. "They're not bluffing." By dawn, all 7 were processed at the county station. Most clammed up, but one, the quiet one, calm eyes and steady voice, spoke just as they loaded him into a cruiser. He looked at me through the bars, almost smiling. "Phase 4 isn't about you," he said. I said nothing. "You think this ends here. You think it's about land number. It's about pattern disruption. You're not the enemy. You're the prototype." Then he winked, and they hauled him away. Later, while sorting their gear, Langston held up a badge stripped from one of their vests. "Enforcement Tier 1. Phase 4 certified." His jaw tightened. "You know what that means." "I do now," I muttered. The evidence they carried was damning: forged IDs, training schedules, even a group photo with 10 men in vests, Karen in the middle, smiling like a preacher at revival. Above the image, bold letters read, "Phase 4 Ground Team Unit 7, which meant there were at least 6 more teams out there. That night, Langston and I stood on my porch, Max limping at my feet, his eyes sharp on the tree line. The stars were bright, the night deceptively calm. "You think they'll come again?" Langston asked. "They won't stop," I said flatly. "Not until this goes public or I disappear." He studied me sideways. "You've got a plan," I nodded toward the last hard drive sitting on my table, still uncracked. It bore no label, just my name scrawled in thick black marker, Whitaker. "You gonna open it?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "What are you waiting for?" I looked out across the dark field, the fences, the barn, the land I had bled to make my own. Leverage. Because I knew the truth. Once I opened that drive, everything changed. It wouldn't just be about my land. It wouldn't just end Karen's reign. It would expose the entire network, drag the truth into daylight. And it might just end me in the process. But I wasn't afraid. Because sometimes to kill a lie that big, you've got to burn it down from the inside out. And I was ready to light the match. When I look back at everything that happened, the fake signs, the patrols, the raids in the dead of night, I realize this story was never just about me or Karen. It was about how fragile freedom can be when ordinary people surrender their voices to fear and control. Karen didn't need real laws or real authority. All she needed was silence, compliance, and neighbors too afraid to question her clipboard. That's how tyranny begins, small, disguised as order, until it consumes everything. The lesson is simple but powerful. Never give away your right to stand tall on your own land, your own principles. Bullies thrive only when we look away. But when even one person refuses to bend, the facade cracks and truth finds its way out. So if this story struck a chord, I want to hear from you. Have you faced your own Karen? Have you seen power abused in your neighborhood? Share it in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more stories that expose the battles hidden in plain sight, subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest wars.